Hello and welcome to a new series, Archaeo-Scope. Now, in this series, I wanted to try and bring an archaeologist's perspective, a historical context, a long-term view maybe, and focus it on current events, happenings, trends, and through this maybe come to a place where new answers are found or new connections are made by discussing observations about modern life and maybe what they mean in the context of history, and whether or not people should be more aware of their context in history, or whether or not people like me, archaeologists, are simply being too fussy, too sensitive to these things, and maybe we should learn not to talk about them. Obviously, I don't tend to be on that side of the fence, but yes, we'll see. But anyway, this series hopefully will be really quite interesting, and actually today's topic was the inspiration for this series. It's a topic which, or a trend, an observation which I've been making over the past couple of years really, and I thought it was a culturally significant tendency or trend, especially in terms of the frequency of these observations, and therefore I thought I'd bring it to your attention, and hopefully out of this will come an interesting discussion. Now, I don't mean to, or rather I certainly don't expect to be able to present answers in these videos. This is not an answers video, this is a question video. So really I'm asking a series of questions, throwing in a series of historical observations and current observations, and out of that maybe together we'll find something interesting. So none of the videos in this series, Archaeo-Scope, are answers, they are discussion videos. So with that in mind, let us proceed. Today's topic is based on the ongoing observation, a repeated observation, that particularly when I go to supermarkets or DVD stores, or when I go to computer game stores and they have a DVD section, the observation of the repetition of the imagery of the Crusader, often a person in a Knights Templar costume, looking a bit bloody or mucky with a sword, either looking really proud and angry, or looking full of anguish and regret. And this repeated image has just become more and more obvious to me the more I've seen it. I've only actually been able to find a few instances for today's video because I couldn't remember them all. But it's something which I have definitely noticed when we've been going shopping, or when we've gone to a DVD store, and I've gone, oh, well, there's another one, or isn't that? Oh no, that's a new film. And therefore I thought there must be something that this imagery is feeding. There must be a demand which they are providing the videos to fill. There must be a certain desire to see films about the Crusades and about this sort of grungy portrayal of the Crusades. Now, the Crusades in film, being portrayed in film, is nothing new, especially in Hollywood. In the 20th century, there was these sort of grand vistas, these medieval pastiches where castles were larger than life. Adventures took place on spiral staircases with clearly drawn lines between bad guys, good guys, damsels in distress. Sword fights were elaborate and swashbuckling, and there was a real sense of adventure. And many of the more negative aspects of the Crusades, especially, were completely ignored. This was truly a quilt. It was a patchwork quilt of ideas and concepts from and about the medieval world. Now, in more recent years, there's been an attempt to revisit, especially in Western cinema, the Crusades, and ask probing questions. One of the best examples of that in recent years was Kingdom of Heaven by Ridley Scott, where at the end of that film, he very explicitly said, made the connection between what happened at the events in the film and the modern situation in Jerusalem and in the Middle East today. He says, peace in the Kingdom of Heaven remains elusive to this day. The Kingdom of Heaven being one of the names for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And actually, during that film, many people were surprised. Many critics commented that Ridley Scott's portrayal of Salah ad-Din had been a revelation. It had been very surprising to see a man who wasn't just a hate-filled, anti-Christian maniac. Rather, he had an awful lot of pressure on him politically. to get certain things done, i.e. to take Jerusalem back for the Muslims, but also as well that he didn't behave in a revengeful way. There was the question asked as whether or not he was potentially a bit more civilized than the people who had taken Jerusalem from Muslims previously, in as much as he actually apparently didn't murder people without there being good reason behind it. He wasn't just a slaughterer. So that portrayal of this character was very interesting, but since then there've been a sequence of films which have had the imagery of the Crusader on the front, and it seems to be a genre almost, a film which is trying to seek out some sort of raw, messy, blood-soaked, dirty history, and I can't help but wonder why that is. Now, the Crusades in history, in actual history, obviously are infamous, and there are two particular events that are worthwhile highlighting. One of them is the siege of Mara in the First Crusade, where Crusaders turned up at the city, had to overwinter there, and during the winter actually barbecued Muslims. There are accounts of, for example, Muslim children being roasted on spits because essentially they had to turn to cannibalism. There were too many people for the land, and it was the winter, so they ended up eating people. And another event from the Fourth Crusade is actually, I suppose, almost at the other end of the spectrum there in terms of on whom the violence was being enacted, where Crusaders actually besieged and sacked a Christian city, namely Constantinople. So it's not just clear-cut violence between Christians and Muslims, but it's also about Christians and Christians. Basically, it's about humanity being terrible to themselves. So the Crusades in history are potent and blood-soaked and really rather horrible in many ways. And actually, if you use the word crusade in our society, often you're talking about a righteous cause. You're crusading for a charity, or you're crusading to highlight an obscure illness and get funding for research for it. Whereas crusades, the word crusades in the Middle East is still very much connected with memories of, for example, cannibalism, of this terrible clash, this human impact, and of course the very real tension between religious beliefs as well. So the Crusades and what the word means and what the associations are very complicated, and it's certainly not that old Hollywood idea. But the question is then, why on earth are we returning to? Why is this supposedly supply and demand? This demand for these blood-soaked Crusader type films, and why is it that's being supplied so readily and, as I say, so relatively frequently? Well, for a start, I can't help but think, when I think of Knights Templar, when I think of Crusades, I think of, or rather I make the connection with Englishness. And especially being a Welshman in England, I cannot help but be aware, for example, during football matches, of supporters wearing sort of fake chainmail, that sort of woolen chainmail with a white shirt and a big St. George's cross on, holding a beer, cheering on their English football team, having a great day out. And it is undeniably an iconic image. But that said, though, it's also possibly a rather distasteful image. As I say, to this day, many people, many cultures still associate that imagery, that person, that personage, that visage of a person, I suppose, that image, with horrible atrocities such as cannibalism. So in some ways this iconic image is being used in sporting arenas because it isn't fully understood. The best sides of the Crusades are very commonly understood. The idea of it being a righteous desire to achieve something, or of it being maybe violence enacted with a cloak of honor around it somehow. The idea of holding your sword as a cross, almost. Those things are very much known about, but maybe people should be more aware of the fact that many people actually don't see it as a righteous cause. They don't see it as something which should be revelled in or should be glorified. I suppose there's a political and economic context going on here as well. Many people at the moment are losing their jobs, and many people at the moment are struggling economically. And they're struggling to keep body and soul together, and they're struggling to make ends meet. And perhaps these past few years have seen a desire to look back into the past to a time when life was more simple, when boundaries were simpler, when the perception that people coming in and taking our jobs or whatever was more easily dealt with. There is undeniably, especially in Britain at the moment, a political shift in terms of focus towards, for example, immigration. And maybe what we're seeing here is a sort of a wistful fantasy that somehow in the past life was better, life was simpler because men were men and our borders were our borders, and we could stop the French or the people from the Middle East or whatever from doing what they wanted because we had a sword and we could whack you in the face. Maybe that's what's happening. I don't know. And as I say, remember, these aren't answers, these are questions that I'm asking. There's also the question of power and meaningful lives. The number of people who feel very disenfranchised, disempowered actually at the moment is really quite high, especially in the northeast of England. And in many ways, you will hear in a similar way people talk about zombie apocalypses, where if a zombie apocalypse happened, life would be simpler, and all we'd have to think about is just survival. Never mind my job, never mind my bank account or laws or government. I could just get on with looking after me and mine, and I'd survive. And maybe in the same way that people sort of fantasize in that sense about zombie apocalypses, perhaps what we're seeing is a very similar portrayal and idea that life in the past was more manageable, that perhaps life was much more about the basics, me, my family, the food and other things that I need, and just surviving. Maybe that's what we're seeing. And it's a reaction against having no power, having no money in our lives, having no ability to plan too far ahead because of political and economic uncertainty. That said, though, all of this to one side, maybe it's a great thing that there is a desire, a new wave of demand for films which portray the medieval period in a grungy way, in a way which isn't that Errol Flynn and pointy hats and damsel in distress kind of world. Perhaps it's really good actually that there is this desire to see the medieval world as not necessarily a pleasant life, but rather a difficult, simple, bare bones, as I say, bloody, conflict-filled, disease-ridden world. Maybe that's good, and maybe actually as archaeologists and historians we should be applauding the fact that people aren't just romanticising the past, they're also looking at the nitty-gritty, they're looking literally at the gritty, they're looking at the horrible stuff in the past, as well as fantasising about a simpler life. Perhaps that's to be applauded. Also, as well, there's the element of fun. I cannot deny that some of these films are great fun to watch. I mean, there's the film Black Death with Sean Bean, which I do own and put on every now and then. But often when I do put it on, I'm good for 6 months. It's like, oh no, I don't need to see that film again for a while because it's just so grim. It's just so depressing. That said, though, it's filled with lots of it's almost like watching a horror film. That's lots of gore and blood and guts and violence. So maybe it's just fun. Maybe what we're seeing is the equivalent of people going to the theme park and they just want to see escapist, violent, fun, grim, dark, kind of almost sort of naughty giggling sort of, films. Maybe that's what we're seeing. And there's nothing all that significant. And in that sense, perhaps, overarchingly, as an archaeologist or historian, I am reading too much into this. That said, though, maybe I'm not reading too much into it, and perhaps what we actually need is a little bit more awareness of what this imagery actually invokes for so many people, so that we don't lightly walk into having fun with the Crusades, when in fact we should be going, the Crusades, they were pretty grim. Of course, it's important, and it does feed into modern identity, especially in Europe and the Middle East. But perhaps you cannot read too much into this. Perhaps there's as much as people are embracing the grittiness and the grimness of medieval life, they also need to embrace the very real connections and political links between then and now, and the impact that those times have upon now and the modern political and geographical and geopolitical landscape. But as I say, maybe I am just reading too much into it. It's just films, Mark. Relax. Go and get some popcorn. We'll watch it together. Who knows? So there you go. That's basically the kit and caboodle of this discussion, or these questions rather. And I'd really like now to see what your thoughts are. Please do comment below. Keep them civil, keep them clean, and hopefully we'll come up with new connections, new questions, new ideas by talking about this trend in current popular culture. Hopefully this has been an interesting video, and hopefully future ones will be just as useful and or interesting as well. So yes, go and have a think and then have a chat. Well, until next time, guys, look after yourselves, and bye bye.